Hey everyone, Jason Sherman here with Strap On Your Boots. In today's episode, I have a special guest with me. Slater Victoroff is the founder and CTO at Indigo Data. Welcome to the show, man.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cool. Just in a nutshell, say I'm in an elevator and I'm an investor and you want to pitch me Indigo Data. What exactly does it do in layman's terms?
Indigo Data is an unstructured data platform. So wherever you've got text, audio, images, right, all of that broadly unstructured data documents, we have a set of AI tools that let non-technical people, kind of create their own applications on top of that sort of data, which, generally has been very difficult.
Right. And so when you say build an application on top of data, again, I'm gonna go towards my listeners who probably don't know they have no idea what you just said. I'm gonna break it down into, like, let's say there's a Google Doc, right? Or a Microsoft Word document. And inside that document, there are some images, there are some text paragraphs, there might be, an audio note that you made from your iPhone.
Yep.
And
totally.
so what would I do with that exactly? How does artificial intelligence, come into play here?
Yeah. So the way to think about it, there's three things you can do, really. You can automate something, right? So imagine that, the Google Doc is an invoice or contract or something like that. And you've got 100 or, like 1,000 of them, right? Just a whole bunch of them. It's like not really for individuals. It's for, large enterprises. But you've got a whole bunch of these contracts that you want to churn through, right? And you would sort of show the machine a couple of examples. Here's how I process these documents. Here's the information I care about in this contract. And then it sort of churns through the rest of it in either, sort of an automated or sort of an augmented assisted way, depending on, sort of what you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of that's a really common one on sort of automate. There's also sort of broader analysis, right? Just like I've got questions that I want to ask, and there you come up with sort of specific questions.
So it's almost like a knowledge base. So if I have a lot of
you can do stuff in that.
I have a lot of documentation, I need to get answers that are regularly asked by clients or employees.
Yep.
And you can ask the AI, well, how do I find out what the percentage, daily invoice income is? And then it would be able to parse the data and spit out an answer for me, rather than having to find someone to go through 1,000 spreadsheets or whatever and figure out the number, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. That's a great example of, an analysis kind of use case. Though I would say it's usually like PDFs more than you're talking spreadsheets. Sure. But
it's data basically.
Yeah, it's the unstructured stuff just happens to be particularly tricky. So, images and, text and language and stuff like that. Whereas, when it's in an Excel document and rows and columns, it's just it's a lot easier to deal with, is the delta there.
So let's take a step back. The episode that we're doing today is how AI is going to evolve in the business world, or how it's going to be used in the business world, or where it's headed, right? Where is AI headed in the business world? Mm-hmm. And so what are the top, say 3 things that AI is being used for in business today that maybe not 10 years ago?
I mean, frankly, automation has been huge. I think that's obviously the elephant in the room. So I think that's as reasonable a place to start as any. Is, you've seen a lot of, I think, variations in how people apply it to automation. I think that you have on the one side sort of RPA, right? And they're using certainly a good amount of AI technology, but that's sort of about finding where elements are on a screen. So, you can click the right button that, maybe a human used to click that button on the interface. But, I think you're starting to see a lot more happening, certainly in the document space, contract analysis, invoice processing, those are huge. And, just if you think banking, financial services, right, they deal with so much paper, loan applications, mortgage documents, appraisals. So, that kind of whole world of document analysis and document, automation and augmentation, that's getting, pretty big.
Yeah, from what I can tell, it seems like a lot of smart contracts, like in the crypto and blockchain space, are implementing AI because there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of paperwork between two parties, like say a buyer and a seller. or a lawyer and a client, and there's money being exchanged and there are contracts being written up, and it's a very long, tedious process where you have to not only send the transaction through the bank or a credit card, but then you have to fill out paperwork, mail it in through FedEx, sign, and there's a million things you have to do, right? Well, AI can do all of it automatically based on a set of programmed, actions. So it knows what it's supposed to do. Where does AI come? Like, what I'm curious about, and what I think the listeners are going to want to know exactly when it comes to what you're mentioning, documents and contracts and things like that. Why does the AI do a better job than, say, humans when it comes to the transactions and the contracts?
So let me maybe try to change your way of thinking about this a little bit, because I'll say that really, and I think a lot of people do have this mentality, right, of sort of AI agents, right? It's a very bad model. Because that's not actually what is happening. That's not what they are doing. It's actually, those actions are 100% software. There's really no AI involved in there whatsoever, right? That's an API hook that says, okay, execute this, execute that, right? So where you see AI coming in these, let's use the contract example because I think it's a good one. So let's say I sign, 1,000 sales contracts with folks, and, some new data regulation comes out, right? I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but now, I have to look through each of these contracts and figure out, okay, am I in compliance? Am I not in compliance? Right. That, and this is something that, companies do all the time. It's very, very common. So where you see the AI come in, right, is then that idea of, okay, let's figure out what analysis you have to do to that contract to figure out whether or not you're in compliance, and then help you. Because, again, like, when you get to the scale of these large enterprises, you're talking about initiatives that are going to be lasting years and costing millions of dollars just to do this sort of contract audit.
And the contracts can be like 50 pages long, or even
that's not even that bad,
or 200 pages.
Absolutely.
But so you're telling me the AI at this point today is able to review a 200-page contract, and it knows that, these are the clauses that are in there. These are the terms that are in there. These are all legit. It's missing this clause. It's missing this,
Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Right. And
I'll
say, 200
that's pretty powerful, man.
Yeah. That's probably, like the edge of what is possible, but that's exactly the kind of stuff that we do. In fact, we even go up to like 1,000-page long documents. And, what I will say, and this I think is important on sort of the model is, it is like assistive technology first and foremost, right? So, it's less that, the AI does this in like an autonomous way. And it's much more that sort of a human working hand in hand with an AI can, get through this work, 10 times or more faster than they could otherwise.
But can you take that same statement and say, it's like a human working with a lawyer, but instead you just have this assisted AI? Are you able to perform the same duties?
I think that, yes, but I think the analogy I really like is a bionic arm almost, right? So we see it's really, really rare that you're going to like replace that lawyer. It's much more common that you're going to take that lawyer and say right now, 90% of the work the lawyer has to do is like really repetitive and like not very interesting or innovative, right? You allow that person to do 10 times the work they could otherwise. The bionic arm is kind of nice because it's like, you still have a human, whatever, going over and lifting the box, but now, you can lift 1,000 pounds, right? You can shot put. I don't know exactly,
so are you saying that this means that, like, say I had to do, a really important agreement with a corporation, or say I'm getting investment for a startup, right? It's a big one, term sheets, right? And those are historically $3,000 to $5,000 from a lawyer, right? That's the price that I've gotten. Mm-hmm. So are you telling me I can get a boilerplate term sheet from an investor, pass it through the AI? It tells me, well, these are the things you should look at. And then I could highlight those things. I don't have to worry about 90% of the contract. And instead, I tell the lawyer, look, this is a term sheet. I've already gone through 90% of it. These are the three things I need to highlight. Let's talk about those three things. He only charges me for an hour, and I get charged $200.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. We see stuff like that all the time. Like customer onboarding is another great example. Is like, hey, like I'm a big financial institution, and like you're going to give me, $10 million to invest on your behalf. The contract that says, here's what you're allowed to do with my money, that is long, that is significant. And you got to understand every piece of that. So, the AI in that case, what it does is it says, okay, this 100-page long document. It's got to go to, these 14 different departments, and, like finance has to review this part and you have to review that part, right? Has to keep it all straight and sort of flag for each one of them. Okay, here are the 4 clauses that like these, you really want to focus on. These 10, like whatever, that's boilerplate.
Got it. Yeah. All right. So aside from documents, because we covered that already extensively, I would think.
Yeah.
AI. I mean, I've had some episodes in terms of AI and the future of where AI is going to be assisting humans in general, not just with work. So what do you think is going to be the next big part of, the AI revolution in terms of society and like, humankind in general?
One place in AI that I think is often underappreciated is actually the intersection with creativity and art. It's really funny. So one of the original founders of Indico, Alec Radford, this was how he kind of got into the space originally. Is these computational art projects. And I think that, Adobe has done a really good job of adopting some of these features where they're sort of figuring out, things like neural style transfer, right? And I think, first and foremost, it's a great example of, it really doesn't make sense, I think, for anyone to say like, oh yeah, we're going to like replace artists. No, we're going to turn this into like an incredible set of tools in their arsenal. And I'm just really, really excited for an increase in the accessibility of that stuff.
Well, and isn't that just the difference between a human and an AI, is that humans have creativity and we have, this innate ability to create things, whereas AI is taking a set of programmed information or data, or they're pulling information from resources. They're learning based on, again, data, whereas we are just thinking of things and we're, creating things, and they don't have that kind of thought process. They only know what we tell them, right? I mean, isn't that kind of how it works?
I don't disagree, I think, with anything you're saying, but I think I would frame it differently.
I'd love
only
to
because
hear
I
your
think
thoughts.
creativity is sort of a fuzzy thing, right? And I think that anyone looking at the output of something in neural style transfer, right, or these generative models, right, or Deep Dream, if you check these things out, they're like super cool to Google, just like awesome videos to watch. But someone looking at that, it's a hard argument to make to say computers aren't creative, because they are creating these incredible one of a kind works of art. But I very much agree, they are only doing what we tell them to do. But we can, for instance, tell them to be creative for a particular definition of creativity, right?
Right, because I mean, I've seen like the AI that created a one-of-a-kind, artistic painting based on like Rembrandt and Renoir and Picasso and all these, artists. So it saw like a million paintings and then it painted its own version of it. So is that really creative, or is that imitation?
It's a great question, right? But I think what I do is I flip the question around, right? Which is, what is great art? And I think here's where people get caught up, right? Which is I would go ahead and assert there's not an objective standard of great art, right? And so in the same way that there's not an objective standard of great art, there's not necessarily some objective standard of creativity. And what we are trying to do is explicitly mimic, what humans like, what humans think is creative. And so it's not that this is a limitation on AI. It's not that we, haven't broken through that. It's that there's not necessarily another way for it to be, right? We're creating tools for us. And so it only makes sense that we're in control of that definition of success.
I mean, eventually, I'm sure you agree with this too, is once the singularity happens, which we're all patiently waiting for that, right? Once that happens, that is when supposedly AI will become infinitely more powerful and knowledgeable than human history combined, and then maybe it would have some sort of creativity and be able to be autonomous. And how far along do you think we are from having the singularity happen?
So I think that I would divorce things, I think pretty heavily from each other there. So I think say the singularity happens, right? The question of what AI is in a post-singularity world, I think it's not really defined probably at that point, or it's exactly what it is today, right? And it hasn't necessarily changed. And there's, like a singularity person, and AI would still be a separate thing by its very definition. And I think that's another thing that people don't necessarily, and sorry, I guess the other thing that I would say is that I think that when people talk about things like AGI and superintelligence and whatnot, I think that it's a very comforting thought in a lot of ways. But I think that more than anything, it's sort of a genie in the bottle sort of pitch, right? I think that it's sort of, again, it's compelling. It's just this idea of like, oh, network effects and intelligence, and somehow, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, all the world's problems are solved, right?
I mean,
But I think that's the problem.
That's the idea, right?
That is the idea. But I think that, and maybe I'm too
So do you not do you not think that when the singularity happens, AI is a thing, and instead of Skynet, we get this all powerful, AI that starts creating robots and starts being able to kind of do things that help the world instead of hurt the world? You don't think that's possible?
I think that the notion of autonomous AI is rooted in science fiction more than anything, and it's importantly, it's not a technical limitation. Like it's a limitation of like, it's not a concept that you can actually, define in reality, I would suppose. Right?
Well, aren't we living in a sci-fi world? I mean, we have iPhones and satellites and spaceships, and we, go to the moon. And
I mean, in some ways, right? But there are things that can exist and things that only exist in science fiction, for instance, right? And I think, for instance, like Ultron, like Age of Ultron, right? Like that's science fiction, but it's science fiction that can't possibly exist in reality, right? And that's what I kind of argue, is that that's the only place where you see sort of this notion of super intelligence. And I would argue in realistic science fiction, it's not something which you can actually, define, right, outside. And that's why I kind of refer to it as a genie in the bottle, right? It's not like you're pointing at, we create, a photovoltaics cell, whatever, that's 90% efficient, which whatever, that's impossible. Like you can't actually do that, but you can define it, right? You can be like, all right, what would the ramifications of that be if we successfully created such a thing?
Where do you see AI kind of evolving in the business world over the next decade or couple decades, from your perspective, like what you're working on? Like where do you see it really helping businesses?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the main advances that we see sort of looking forward have to do with the sort of control pains, I would say, right? As what we've done is we've kind of really vastly outstripped our ability to sort of instruct, if you will. So an example, for instance, in one of the most recent OpenAI papers, Clip, have you heard of zero-shot learning?
I have not.
Okay, so zero-shot learning is just this idea that you have a model that works without training data, right? And it turns out it's not really a thing, right? So for instance, right, what they've done is, and we've created tons of models that do this, right? And you imagine, so ImageNet is a good example. So you've got a data set, it's got 1,000 images in 1,000 classes, dogs, trains, cars, and if you can figure out what each image is, the idea is that's some kind of indication of artificial intelligence. And so people have been making, for a long time, these models that basically do this without using any of the ImageNet training data. But really what they're doing, right, and this is what you call zero-shot learning, but really what they're doing is that they're using the label, right, the name of that label, say car or plane or train, that then becomes the training data. So really what it is it's just very, very low shot, like less than one example learning. And it was really interesting. There's this whole field now called prompt engineering, right, where the idea is that by packing words around that prompt, so plane. So you say rather than framing, plane and like link it to plane, you ask the AI like, is this a picture of a plane? And it sounds kind of like a dumb thing, right? But by just adding that definition, you radically improve these models to the point where just some really basic tweaks, like, is this a picture of a plane? Like, how sure are you this is a picture of a plane? You get, like the same efficacy as 4 times the amount of training data.
Sounds like you're making it think. Like, is this? Are you looking at something? Are you? Is this something? And it has to kind of like process and think.
Framing the problem correctly. That is what you're doing, right? It has all of the information already. It's just that we don't have the ability to ask the question in the right way yet. That's what I would say.
Awesome. And thanks for coming on the podcast. Where can businesses or listeners learn more about what it is you do, or if they need, your service or whatnot?
Yeah, you can go to indico.io to learn more about Indico, or, follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter or Quora.
Cool, man. Appreciate it, Slater. This was pretty interesting. I learned quite a bit about AI and stuff I didn't know about. So it's pretty cool. Hope you listeners also learned something new, and we will see everyone in next week's episode.